Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Christmas edition of the PixelCast. I am Jeremy Alessi, the founder of PixelFest, and this week I want to do a quick episode. Holiday time is a time to spend with friends and family, but if you need to get a little bit of a fix of growing through love of games, you're a developer, you're a player thinking of becoming a developer, then this is the place for you. And obviously, this is going to be coming out Thursday, December 26th, so a day after Christmas. I could not justify releasing one on Christmas, as it is a very important day, and I think that hopefully the birth of Christ is a good reason to put off an episode for one day, although I want to be consistent and get these things out once a week. So without further ado, let's get into something that has been on my mind. I started thinking about all the influences that I had as a child growing up that led me to become a video game developer, and what I wanted to do was cover the first 10 years via Christmas, or as near as I can remember what were Christmas presents growing up. So I want to start in 1982 and get all the way into 1991 with the culmination of the Super Nintendo, which for me was sort of the end of childhood, the beginning of becoming a teenager. But the first thing I want to talk about here is the Coleco head-to-head baseball. This is the first video game I can remember owning. It was portable, it played music, it would take me out to the ball game when you booted it up. It was two-player, and I had a lot of fun in 1982 taking this to my cousin's house after Santa Claus brought me the gift. And, this is a game that I think had a remarkable amount of depth considering the hardware limitations at the time, and I would love to be able to get my hands on one today. As a child, I think I remember just really liking to hit the ball in this game, and I just was doing a little bit of reading on this, a little bit of sort of retroactive research, if you will, and it seems like it had the ability to steal, to switch pitching styles, to switch hitting styles. It seemed to be a lot of detail with this. So anyway, this was a really neat video game system, sort of the Nintendo Switch of its time. It was portable, it was multiplayer, it was fresh, and I had a great time with it back in 1982. Heading into 1983, we have the Texas Instruments Speak and Spell. Now this isn't a video game per se, although certainly the system contained spelling games on it that were challenging and are still fun today. In fact, Santa Claus brought my daughter one of these this year, and that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this episode. It sort of reminded me of all the things in childhood and childhood Christmases that influence us. So the Speak and Spell, of course, was a little bit more of an educational toy rather than a straight video game. Nevertheless, it made its way into popular culture. It was featured in E.T. E.T. used Speak and Spell to call home, and I, as a child, even remember thinking, wow, I could be like Matthew Broderick and hack into things with my Speak and Spell. I carried it around with me everywhere as the first sort of laptop, if you will, and I just remember thinking I could do so much more with it than I actually could. Nevertheless, this was a very cool, very, very cool toy computer video game that sort of was one of the first things that led me on the way to becoming a game developer, I think, and a software developer. Okay, heading into 1984, my family got the Atari 5200. Now, we were a little bit behind that year. I think that Santa Claus wanted to start us off a little bit slowly. As I'm aware now, the Atari 7800 was available, and the Nintendo Entertainment System may have been available in limited quantities that year, but what we ended up with was the Atari 5200, which I think was the perfect gaming system to start off with. The games were inexpensive, they were plentiful, it was a big, sort of bulky system, it was hard to break, and so this was the first video game console that hooked up to a TV that I can remember having in our family, and it was the perfect start. Wasn't the newest, flashiest, greatest thing on the block, but it was certainly a good starter video game system. Heading into 1985, again, and you see a little bit of a pattern here, going back and forth between things that are educational toys and things that are straight up video games. The Armitron was the big thing that I remember receiving from Santa Claus in 1985. And you could play games with it, but it was more games that you would make up. It was a little bit more of a sandbox toy. The arm had a variety of controls where you could rotate the arm, and you could rotate it about multiple axes and move it around. You could pick things up, and so this was a great little robotic tool to make your own games with. And I think that had a little bit of an influence on me, no doubt. It's one that I remember fondly to this day. And there it is, 1986. This was the year that Santa brought us a Nintendo Entertainment System. Had a great time right off the bat with this. I actually had a little bit too good of a time. The first time that I was allowed to play this system, I sat down early in the morning. I think I woke up like as soon as the sun came up, maybe before. Started played the game system for 12 or 14 hours, and by that evening, I was sick as a dog. I was I was ill to the point of pain. I remember that, but for some reason, I was not discouraged from playing video games. And in fact, after that, I was just encouraged more. I think the Nintendo, took a hold of me as it did the whole culture at that time, and is, of course, one of the most iconic video game systems ever invented. Now, heading into 1987, there was this realization for me as a child. I saw the worlds of my father's generation and my generation cross. My father used to love to get the pay-per-view box, rent it, and throw a big party for any boxing matches. We watched almost all of Mike Tyson's fights in the 80s. They were very short, very decisive fights, and a lot of times people were complaining, but the parties were fun nevertheless. Now, on the flip side, of course, I had this NES, and I was getting into video game culture starting then, and I just thought it was so neat that I could take something that was so meaningful and influential for my father, and I could sort of cross it with something that was so meaning and influential to me. And this was the time that I really started noticing how many licensed video games were coming around and how video games really started to embed themselves in the popular culture. And Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is probably the first game that I really took notice of, and of course Santa brought this to me in 1987. Had a fantastic time playing this game, and it's one that I still have today, and I think it's one that still holds up very well. The art is great, the gameplay is great, and of course there's that pop culture influence, which was so impressive at the time. Heading into 1988, this was a little bit of a controversial year for me. So in 1987, of course, the hype really started building for video games, and I thought that was a cool thing. I read a lot about Super Mario Brothers 2 from 1987 to 1988. I read about it in there was a Boy Scouts magazine. I forgot the name of it right now, but I remember reading about it in there. It was in comic books. It was in all the video game magazines. I think the very first cover of Nintendo Power, of course, was Super Mario Brothers 2. So this game was like full hype mode back then. Everybody was talking about it. Nobody could wait. And it was the first time I also remember seeing in the stores, people that were buying it in the stores, of course, it was hard to get a copy. It was the first time that I remember there being like a video game shortage and nobody could get their hands on this. People were selling them for hundreds of dollars if you could get a copy. And I was very lucky. Santa Claus brought me a copy that year, so I must have been a good kid. But this game, it disappointed me though. At the end of the day, that's all I could say. When I first booted it up, everything was great. I thought the graphics were really good. It was fresh. It was very different from the other Super Mario Brothers. It's very imaginative. All that was fantastic, but I think the game was very difficult. And I reached a part as a child where there were very skinny pipes, and you had to do these precision jumps to get across them. And if you lost, you had to start the game over again. And it was very punishing and unforgiving. I'm imagining the game is probably fairly short. This is one that I plan to go back to using the Switch Online NES emulator and using that cool rewind feature to play and see if I can get through that part today. But ultimately, this left me slightly disappointed. Now, it was a disappointment that sank in after a while. And I think this actually ended up being the first video game that I sold like secondhand, because I just said, you know what, I'm done with this video game. There's another kid that wants it, and I ended up selling it a few months later. The first day, the first moments that I played the game, I wasn't disappointed. In fact, I can remember that Christmas, after we got to play with our gifts and everything like that, I can remember carrying the little manual with me around all day in the car and reading and reading and reading. But yeah, it was one of those things that after a few weeks, maybe a few months, I realized I'm not getting anywhere with this game, and I'm actually disappointed by this thing. The game didn't live up to the hype. It overpromised and underdelivered is what I felt as a child. So, it's one that I have to revisit today, though. Heading into 1989, we have the Nintendo Game Boy. Now, this this brought together the great video games that were complicated with wonderful music and gameplay from the Nintendo, and then sort of tied back in with that really cool portability that we saw with things like the Speak and Spell and the Coleco head-to-head baseball. So you could do multiplayer if you hooked them up together. Graphics were somewhat limited because it was only 4 shades of gray, but the gameplay was every bit as complex as any NES game that you would play at the time. So the Game Boy was really amazing. Obviously, you had games like Tetris. I think I got Tennis, which actually ended up being a really cool game, and Super Mario Land. So those are the games I remember getting. And there was a Castlevania game that was really incredible at the time. The graphics were like hard to believe, and I understand that that's hard to believe looking back now, but even with 4 shades of gray, you got these really detailed graphics and these deeply detailed level designs with lots of rooms and everything like that. It was unseen at the time. At that time, the thing that we were playing portably, we would play NES at home, and we'd play little Tiger electronic games. Those were fun. Those were all the rage at the time. But once the Game Boy came out, that was it. It was Game Boy all the time. And to this day, of course, Nintendo still has a big focus on portable games, and I think we have the Game Boy to thank for that. Okay, heading into 1990, I got my first taste of 4-player video game tournaments at home, and this is obviously something that we see still today influencing games. I think we can play many more than 4 people now with wireless controllers, but of course this carried forward into the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Dreamcast. This idea that we would serve up 4 ports instead of 2 in a traditional video game console. So in 1990, I got the 4-score, and I also got Ivan Stewart's Off-Road. And my friends and I had an absolute blast with this. This was some of the most fun that I can remember. And this game, Off-Road, it wasn't really a very good game if you played it by yourself. In fact, you almost just wouldn't play it by yourself. It was okay. It had good physics and controls and so on and so forth, but it just really came alive in 4-player mode. And I also had Gauntlet 2 at the same time. It was all part of that year, and Santa was very generous, but it was Off-Road that was really the great game. Gauntlet 2, pretty fun. My friends and I played it a little bit, but this is the one that had us hooting and hollering and laughing and ribbing each other while we were playing. And this was sort of the first introduction to what I would call couch multiplayer gaming, where you basically have a party on the couch and everybody's just going wild. And these are the types of games that I really love even to this day. And this is the type of experience that as a developer I still want to recreate, whether it be this or GoldenEye or Smash Brothers or Super Mario Kart. The spirit of the action is the same. So 1990, that was a pretty seminal moment in my game player developer career. So, okay. And last but certainly not least, 1991 marked the release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And this was a game changer. Now, in the early days, covering all that stuff in the 80s, I was young. I remember a decent amount about those games, but it's the Super Nintendo that this is when I really, really became a video game fan, I would say, where I really started to get heavy into it. And maybe this is when I started thinking about making games. Certainly, this is when I started to become more obsessed with the technology itself. I can remember right around that time, maybe the summer after receiving this, getting the first computer science book that I really started to look at. Nobody around me knew anything about this stuff, but I was already starting to study it myself. And I had a ton of fun with the Super Nintendo, and I also learned a lot about reading the technical specs of the system, reading developer interviews. This is where I really started to go in depth with that stuff. And of course, the Super Nintendo came packed with Super Mario World. This was an incredibly fun game. And I remember my buddy Evan and I going back and forth seeing who was on what level. So he got a Super Nintendo the same year as I did. We lived across the street from each other, and we would call each other up, be like, what level are you on? Did you make it past this part? And although the game wasn't really 2-player competitive, we sort of played it that way on each of our copies. But then what we would do is we'd come over to each other's house and play one person or the other's copy and move them forward. So if I went over to his house, we might move forward 3 or 4 maps or levels, and then of course my copy would be behind, so I'd have to go home and I'd have to play all that to try to catch up, or he would come by my place and we would sort of counterbalance. And we both, I think, completed this whole game and got all the stars and everything like that. And it was actually fun considering it wasn't intended, I don't think, to be played that way, but that's how we ended up playing it. Now, the first game that I played, of course, when I booted it up, once I unwrapped this GIF and everything, everything was said and done, the first game I played was Final Fight. And my friends and I used to go up to Food Line and play this arcade game, and then later on in a 7-Eleven, they had a copy of it as well. And so this was, at the time too, we were getting sort of out of, we were a little bit older, we were getting out of like the super cute fluffy games, and we were moving into these beat 'em ups and these tougher, games that sort of rule your teenage years. Final Fight, of course, was the one I was most excited about. Booted it up, played it. It did not have a two-player mode, so that was a little bit of a bummer. It was only single-player on the Super Nintendo. I think later on they released some two-player simultaneous games, and they also took out the character Guy, who's actually featured like right in the middle of those two guys' chins. So he was in the arcade game. He wasn't in this. Later on, Capcom did release a version called Final Fight Guy, where he was a playable character. Definitely a fun game. Definitely still had a good time. Definitely beat the whole game and everything like that. But it wasn't. I think it ended up not being my most fun memory. It definitely was the one that I wanted for the system because it was the game that I already played. But I still play it today. Still like it. Have nothing bad to say about it. But I was more surprised by a couple other games. First on my list of surprises was SimCity. This was a game that, at the time, I was just like an action player. I was not into simulation games or strategy games or anything like that. They were a little bit above me. And in fact, I think this was a game that Santa actually brought to my stepfather. It wasn't even supposed to come to me. Of course, I couldn't help myself. I had to play it, and I unwrapped it, started playing the game for him. And it turned out to be one of my favorite games of all time. And I think that the reason it was so good was because this was a collaboration between Will Wright and Shigeru Miyamoto. So the game had these, simulation aspects that Will Wright liked to build. He liked to build those systems. But it also had the fun that Shigeru Miyamoto is so known for building. He put a little extra character in there that would assist you. And of course, you had Bowser was one of the natural disasters, and all around, this game was a more cartoony, fun take on SimCity. It was less simmy and a little bit more fun, and still to this day, it's my favorite version of the game. I've actually played several versions of SimCity now, and I think with each one, they try to make it a little bit more fun and less simmy, but I don't think any of those versions ever accomplished what this one did, and this was a surprise for me. I didn't want this game. I just ended up giving it a try and enjoying it. And of course, very last, but certainly not very least, my probably favorite game of all time is Pilot Wings. And this is the game that I wanted because I saw it on like GamePro TV and I saw it in magazines, and I could not wait to experience those pseudo 3D Mode 7 effects. The game also was extremely innovative in a time when most of the games involved beating people up. Even Mario, you're jumping on enemies. There's a sort of violent element to that game. And Final Fight, of course, you're doing nothing but beating people up. And a lot of the games that we played were, beat 'em up, shoot 'em ups, etc. Pilot Wings was this breath of fresh air because even in the flight simulators back then, you were shooting things. One of the memories, I think that same year that I got Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, I also got Top Gun, which is one that I forgot to mention. And of course, in Top Gun, it's a flight sim, but you're shooting guys down. And you take a Star Fox game, you're shooting guys down. But with Pilot Wings, most of the game, there was a scene where you were actually shooting things, but most of the game was spent doing these flight challenges, and it was almost like being efficient in the air, doing acrobatics almost in some capacity. And so the game struck me as being innovative, being really the first 3D game that I really got into. I mean, I'm sure I played a 3D game before this, but this is the one that made me realize the freedom of 3D. And to me, it's just such an elegant, wonderful game. And I immediately had fun with this one. This is the one out of all these games that I go back to and play on a regular basis just because it brings me joy to play it. And wow, that's, going all the way back to 1991. And so those are the first 10 Christmases and the associated video games that I can remember getting from Santa Claus those years, having fun with. And, what are your favorite memories, though, from Christmases past? I would love it if you would share those in the comments or send a message to contact@pixelfest.org, send a message on Facebook or Twitter. I'd like to get the conversation, started on this. And of course, I just want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. It's been a great first year of doing the PixelCast, and I think we're gonna have one more episode, and I'm trying to think if that's gonna be in time for the new year or not after this. But Christmas is such a great celebratory time, and there, of course, there are all these memories of unwrapping the latest, greatest video game under the tree on Christmas. So I just had to do something to talk about this, and something more, I think, for the fun of it. This is where, as developers, a lot of our inspiration comes from. And as you can see from my list, that inspiration to become a game developer is drawn somewhat from the video games that I played, and just as much by some of the gadgets and little computers and so on and so forth that I experienced. So I'm sure that your history is probably somewhat similar, and I'd love to hear about it. So anyway, I'm going to have to say good evening for now. I hope that your Christmas vacation is going great. Let's all continue growing through love of games, and I will see you next week. Thanks again.